The decisions you're making right now about AI adoption, architecture trade-offs, and how your team works together will shape your systems for years. Getting those calls right when the landscape is shifting this fast is hard. QCon San Francisco has spent 20 years connecting senior engineers with practitioners who are a few steps ahead on the same problems. This November 16th through the 20th, 60-plus speakers across 12 tracks will share what's actually working in production and what isn't. No hidden product pitches, just senior practitioners helping senior practitioners. Learn more at QConSF.com.
Hello everybody, I'm Olympio Pop, an InfoQ editor, and I have in front of me Birgitta Böckeler. Probably you remember that we had a similar conversation last year, but as things are changing so fast in the AI landscape, we invited Birgitta again to see what changed in the 365 days since she last looked into that, at least for QCon. Birgitta, if you want to introduce yourself, anything changed on you in terms of position at Thoughtworks?
Yeah, hi Olympia. Thanks for having me again. I'm Birgitta. I'm a distinguished engineer at Thoughtworks, and my distinguished topic, so to say, is how to best use AI on software delivery teams. And I've been doing that full time for 2.5 years now.
That's a lifetime in the AI space.
Exactly.
2.5 years, it's like Middle Ages all the way back to the future. Last year, we discussed vibe coding because that was the topic at that point. And obviously there were still ideas. People were just having bits and pieces that they generated and then they just stitched together. It felt like maybe a fancier Stack Overflow copy pasting stuff because you didn't have to go and move from the IDE. And at that point, it felt like you have a leader, and that the leader was usually those that were based on the Microsoft framework. Cursor was the one that was doing a lot of innovation, and then everybody else was copying. How do you feel things now?
So last year at QCon, I gave a talk. The title was From Autocomplete to Agents, because what I still called at the time agentic modes. So it didn't quite feel like a full agent yet. Those agentic modes were just gaining traction last year in March, April, and the vibe coding term was about 2 months old at the time. And like you said, Cursor was one of the, if not the most popular coding agent or coding assistant. And Claude Code wasn't even around yet, or at least not like big in the public discourse. I think there might have been like an early release already or something like that. So about a year later, I would say that Claude Code is arguably the most popular coding assistant, coding agent, even though Cursor is still very much relevant. But now it seems like the Cursor team is more and more copying from the Claude Code team because they're kind of like setting the pace in terms of ideas and stuff like that. And another thing we talked about a year ago was MCP servers, which had just started happening and were like super popular. And there's now like also alternatives of how you can do stuff, not with MCP servers, because we found some of their downsides. So definitely a lot has happened over the past year.
Yeah, in the company that I'm working, we do use Cursor, but mostly our designers are using it because it's easier for them to integrate Figma through Cursor and then generate. We use Codex rather than Claude. Don't ask me about the reasoning, but that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to stay on that for a bit, like Claude Code versus Cursor, or let's say terminal-based coding agents versus IDE-based coding agents, right? I think because Claude Code has become so popular, and it was the first terminal-based agent that became very popular, even though there were other open source ones before. People often equate it with like, oh, it's so popular because of the terminal experience. But I actually don't personally think that's the case. I think Claude Code works really well under the hood. And you can have the same experience in a more, let's say, graphical user interface, I think, right? So I think it's still a preference. I mean, of course, these terminal-based agents, they have the big advantage that you can run them in a headless mode. So you can also run them in your pipelines or run them more in the background. But now all of the other big coding agent, coding assistant products have started copying this as well. So you now have a Cursor CLI, you have a GitHub Copilot CLI, all of them have CLIs now as well, right? So now it's more like a preference or also a decision in which situation do you use the terminal, in which situation do you use the IDE, right? And like you said, like designers are maybe more comfortable using the IDE because it's still not quite all the way down there in the terminal, which they're maybe not as used to. But I have to say, personally, I use both. So they are my top 2 coding agents that I use at the moment, Claude Code and Cursor. And I sometimes just prefer the more visual view that I have in Cursor. And it also is very strong under the hood, right? But I sometimes prefer in the modes where I want to watch what the agent is doing. Like it's easier for me to process what's going on. And it also has some features that you actually don't have in the terminal, which is like rolling back to an earlier state in the conversation and stuff like that. It's just easier to do in a more graphical environment. So I don't think it's as easy to say like Claude Code is successful because of the terminal and that's the future. I think there's still a lot of benefit, and maybe it's a personal preference, but I think there's still a lot of benefit for the graphical projection of what's going on as well.
For me, what I think Anthropic, the company, manages to do a lot of great stuff is they do a lot of research. And I enjoyed reading about their red teaming, about trying to see how much can they push the agents and, well, the models even before that. So that's what I think they do a lot of great work. The other day I started watching, I think it was a Black Hat, where they were just pointing how they use it in terms of finding vulnerabilities to just see how much can they turn a model. And obviously you see the tool. Now, in terms of the experience, I see a lot of my colleagues and people that are around me that are coming from the product or designer space that do it. So at least that's how we look at it. We don't care about the code itself. We just generate something. It works, and we have a testing suite that we are aligning. And then the developers come and they just start improving those things, creating components that actually, if we don't have them already, and then we are just sandboxing it around that. So, okay, use those components, and then everything is just glue code that is easy to just clean up and make things better. And I think both tools are important because, for instance, it's just throw away code, and I just care about how it actually goes. And I spoke earlier this week with Gunnar Morling, and I think for me, it's the first, let's say, public, maybe production project that somebody worked with vibe coding, whatever it's now. And he was talking about his implementation of Hardwood, which is a Parquet implementation in terms of data storage. And that was quite interesting, the way he was mentioning and making sure that the code is nice. And then it's about optimization. And I think there are moments when we do have to use it.
Yeah, and also like maybe to go back to that designer use case, I think even before designers are using, let's say, Cursor or maybe like a rapid app generation tool like Lovable or Replit or something like that, right? As developers, we can prepare the environment in which they're creating the prototypes to make it more probable that we have to do less polishing later, right? For example, when I create a prototype with something like Replit and then I download the code, it's usually the same tech stack. I know that they have a lot of like prompt orchestration and tooling and stuff like that under the hood that always like creates the same tech stack in a reliable way because they're focusing on front ends, right? And in a larger organization where you have a design system and so on, you can also prepare an environment like that to make the prototypes that they generate closer to what I already need, right? I mean, it's still not a given that then I can just take a prototype and put it in production, right? But it can just make it closer to that. I also hear stories from teams in Thoughtworks about using a design system as a source of knowledge for a coding agent, right? Or even one step before that, maybe almost like reverse engineering or retconning a design system based on the existing code base so that you then have like a nice new abstraction that a coding agent can use and so on.
That's a good idea. And because you mentioned Figma, I have to ask about MCP. We do use MCP because that was the only way how to interact with Figma, at least a couple of weeks back when I last looked into that. What do you think? Is MCP still a story or not?
Yeah, maybe we can open a broader conversation about context engineering while we talk about that, right? Because the term wasn't even around, or at least it wasn't as talked about last year when I spoke at QCon. Again, if we want to compare to what was around about a year ago, I think it started gaining traction around June or so last year. So context engineering meaning you try to tune what the model will ultimately see so that you get better results, right? What it will see, what it will not see. So that's a simple definition, right? And of course, it means different things. Like when somebody's actually building an agent or something, it has very different concerns than when somebody's using a coding agent. And when we're using coding agents, we basically want to put in like our coding conventions, maybe something about our architecture, our general business context. So that's part of the context that we kind of feed it. before it even generates stuff. But then we also give it these like context interfaces, right? So we tell the model, here's a bunch of tools that you can use, right? That's the most generic term for it. And the interfaces of how you can call it. And one of those things is MCP servers, right? By the way, dear large language model, you can access things that are in Figma. And here's the description of how you can do that. And then the models are kind of like trained to be good at creating the structures to calling those MCP servers. Other context interfaces are, for example, the tools that are already built into the coding agent, like how to edit a file, how to do code search, and so on, right? But then the third one that has come up over the past only a few months, I think maybe end of last year, is skills, right? So skills is also a kind of context interface because it's basically initially when you start a session, the large language model just sees a list of skills and descriptions, right? So for example, the description could be how to get Figma designs from our Figma system or whatever, right? I don't know if like maybe for Figma, MCP servers are still the best way to do that. I don't know how exactly the integration with Figma works in an MCP server. It's probably calling the API, right? But with skills now coming around, a lot of people have moved their MCP use cases to skills and to CLIs or scripts. Because now in a skill, you can actually package up multiple files, not just a markdown file, but you can also provide documentation or, like I said, a script or something. So you can say, in this skill is also a script that can call the Figma API, and you can call the script in the following ways, right? So that would be another way to create that Figma integration. So the reason why I think people have shifted towards that and are not defaulting to MCP anymore is, one, that context interface takes up less space in the context window. So you just have the description of the skill, right? And the agent only loads everything that's in that skill folder when the LLM thinks that this is relevant for the task at hand, right? When the LLM is like, oh, looks like I might need Figma designs, let's load this whole folder of resources of how to access Figma, right? So it's kind of a progressive disclosure or lazy loading of context. So that's one reason it's more efficient on the context window. And then the second reason why people are moving to it is, I guess, a little bit of this. When you already have a CLI, right? Like let's say you have the AWS CLI installed on your machine. Why would you run another local process like an MCP server that can access the AWS cloud when you already have the CLI on your machine and the agent could also call that CLI, right? There's, of course, like with an MCP server, you still have almost like a bulwark towards the other system, right? You can put more permissioning in there, and maybe you don't want to give the agent access to everything that a CLI can do that is installed on your machine, right? So there's additional considerations, but that's basically what that shift is about, from MCP to maybe more skills and CLIs and scripts and stuff like that.
Yeah, so to just summarize a bit, we moved from having monolithic, let's call it Claude.md or agent.md, and probably in the smaller pieces, like smaller modules like skills, in which you can define it, and then you just have links to those in the upper initial index, whatever. And MCP is still useful, but at points where we do interact easier with other applications. So another use case that I was looking into was in terms of hardware design. And then you have 3D models and stuff like that is a lot harder to achieve at this point, but it's good for translation. So I think those are the cases. Like you have established tools like Figma or 3D Studio Max or whatever, and then it's a lot easier if you need those kind of things to interact with them. But now, for me, it feels that is a very meta agile development, because MCP was a stepstone. Like as you used to speak some time ago about, you had a thought process about protocols, and then that was going through multiple phases. Now it seems that things are popping up as solutions. They are not useful anymore, and then they are discarded, and everything is moving so fast.
Yeah, again, and I would say there's still use cases for MCP. It's just that for a while, everybody defaulted to it for a lot of cases. And now we have more tools in the toolbox and we can decide what we want to use. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure about it, because on top of that, there are the other agent protocols. I think it's agent to agent, A2A protocols. And talking about tooling, I spoke a couple of weeks back with Will McCagan, and he is one of the people that is very established in the TUI space. And he said, I like AI coding, but I don't like how user interfaces look like in the terminal. So he put together what he calls POD, And what is said is that I took all the richness that I have from textualize and other very intensive textual user interfaces and try to build something new that runs with everything. Obviously, Claude then created some kind of gimmick that you have to use their tool. And there seems to be that this push is bringing together a new renaissance, if you want, of terminal applications.
Yeah. So at Thoughtworks, we have this publication twice a year, the Thoughtworks Technology Radar, and we just had our discussions a few weeks ago about the next edition, and we had 1 or 2 frameworks come up, I think, to build terminal UIs. And at the moment, the most popular open source coding agent, arguably, is OpenCode, which for a while, I never had time to try it out. I just heard everybody talking about it, how great it is. Before, the open source ones that were really popular were Klein and WooCode and Continue. But now OpenCode is the one that has settled as the leader in open source and terminal-based UIs. And there are quite a few things that are different about it that actually makes it feel a bit nicer in terms of the experience than Cloud Code, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there are plenty out there. And back to your point, I think it's context engineering is something very important at this point. It's how you can create it. My feeling is that Claude is able to create that kind of ecosystem where you have a lot of stuff. I was talking to somebody the other week and he was saying it's that they managed to integrate code in their company at the enterprise level. And then he's just going to Claude and says, okay, what are my tasks for the week? And then having access to the inbox, the Jira, and so on and so forth. And it seems that people are now getting highly reliable on these tools because there are some guys say, okay, I'm on the plane. How can I code now, given that I don't have access to the internet or my tokens run out? So
yeah, and that is also something that hasn't really changed, or where we haven't seen a big step change over the last year, is in the use of local models, at least not at that kind of cutting edge agentic experience, right? So there are now ways to connect even Cloud Code to local models, model environments like Olama that you can run on your laptop have started supporting the API that Claude uses to call the model. However, it's just even if you give them a higher context window than Olama provides by default, even if you have not reasonable, but a high amount of RAM on your machines or in general, a strong machine, it's a lot slower. And also the smaller models usually still struggle with the tool calling. So it will be stuff they don't really understand what the tools are that they can call, right? So all those context interfaces that I talked about before, right? The editing tools, the MCP servers, the skills, and so on. So either they just don't even discover them, or they know that they're there, but the models call them with the wrong format, or, all of those things, right? So a model has to be really strong at that to support a good agentic experience. And a lot of the big models are actually fine-tuned, as far as I know, for the tool calling as well. And then in general, the coding agents also have relatively complex prompts, really big system prompts and stuff like that. And that's also what some of the smaller models then struggle with. And they go into loops and, just hang-ups and stuff like that. So unfortunately, we still don't get that cutting edge experience with the locally running model.
Yeah, but it will be probably coming because obviously there are now with the whole sovereignty movement all over Europe, you see people that, okay, when it was a bit funny for me, it was okay, we don't want to be reliable on Claude or Codex or whatever, so we just decided to use Gwen. Well, interesting approach for privacy, dropping Claude or Codex in favor of a Chinese model, but that's also something interesting. Anyway, that's a whole different conversation. Another point that you had was harness engineering, that probably moving along, we'll not discuss about just using something or something else, but we'll just look for those programming language frameworks, whatever, that have the best harness. And given that harness was used in multiple phases, let's try to coin that and make sure that we know exactly what it means.
Yeah, so that's a relatively new term that is gaining traction, at least in the coding agent space, right? So with the more powerful context engineering, and obviously also we've had step changes in how good the models are at coding as well, right? So with those two things combined, it has just continued the push to give the agents more autonomy and to reduce human supervision, right? But if we want to do that, if we want to reduce our supervision, then we have to increase our confidence in what the agent is creating, right? So this term harness engineering has started popping up. And I actually just wrote an article about it as well. And the first thing I did was I was trying to understand, what does that even mean, right? Like in which context, in which bounded context is this term harness being used? It seems like originally it was used as like in the context of talking about evaluation harnesses for large language models. And then in the past few months, it's been used a lot to say, okay, a harness is everything except the model. So an agent is actually a model plus a harness. So that's like a really wide definition, right? So people would, for example, call an agentic framework like Pydantic AI a harness, or they would even call a Claude Code a harness, right? So anything that like orchestrates everything to create that agentic experience. But then if we take it to the bounded context of using a coding agent, right? So like us actually working with a coding agent, then we can actually also build a harness kind of around all the harnesses that we're using under the hood, in the sense of like constraining the agent with different tools and guidance to get better results, right? So what I'm talking about is here, one, like what we feed forward, right? What I talked about before, like we give it coding conventions, we give it context about our architecture. So everything we give it to kind of, we anticipate that the agent might not know this and therefore it might do something wrong. So we're trying to increase its chances of success in its first generation, right? And then secondly, once the agent generates something, we want to immediately give it feedback without even being involved as humans. We want to immediately give it as much feedback as possible so it can self-correct, right? So those would be things like giving it access to static code analysis, or of course it should be able to monitor if the test suite is still green, or stuff like if we have a strongly typed language that it can immediately see when there's like a typing issue, when there's a compiler error or stuff like that, right? So we want to give it like as fast of feedback as possible. And all of those things is kind of like a mix of both, of course, again, AI-based things, right? So to give it feedback, we can also start another AI agent that reviews the code, right? But we can also just give it access to the tools that we also use or maybe underused in the past as humans. I said like static code analysis, maybe even more advanced static code analysis, custom linter, stuff like that, which is now easier to build as well, right? And also in the feed forward, when we try to make it more successful in the first place, we can also use, let's say, CPU-based computational things, right? We can give it access to a language server, for example, so that it can maybe do, IDE-style refactorings by renaming a symbol or something instead of doing it with a text diff, right? So a harness is all about like strategically thinking about what of these like feed forward and feedback things you put in place so that you feel more and more confident to reduce your supervision or to direct it to the places where it's most important that humans look at it, and you don't have to like fix all those small things that maybe an agent can just as well fix itself as long as it has access to feedback.
Okay, so actually harness is a box that until not long ago you felt that is the know-how or the different thing that you have, like best practices, tooling, and so on and so forth.
So far, the developer was the harness.
So now we are moving away from that, and the harness is actually those kind of things that normally you know. And that's the next step, as you said, giving the model more autonomy where you can focus more on the higher level stuff and just on the result.
And there's been a lot of like blog posts and writing from teams who are trying to push into this direction recently. But most of that writing is all about kind of a harness that looks at maintainability, internal code quality, stuff like that. And all the examples I just mentioned are around that as well, like static code analysis and stuff like that, right? But I think then, over time, we can push that into different areas like architecture fitness. We can give it access to architecture fitness functions. And maybe it's not all while the agent is initially working, but it can also be later in the pipelines, right? There was a really good article by a team at OpenAI who have been working on a code base for 5 or 6 months in this manner. And like the main thing that they work on is this harness. Every time something goes wrong, they try to improve the harness first before new code gets written. But there's not that much in all of that yet about like, let's say, a harness for the behavior, right? So I think there's a lot of ideas where I can totally see a path. Oh yeah, we can push this. There's like quite a lot of buffer. We can do more custom static code analysis. We can integrate it with fitness functions, all of these possibilities, right? But with the behavior, it's still kind of like a little bit lackluster. So what I see most people do is like as feed forward, they write a spec, whatever that spec might be, right? It can be just like a prompt or it can be like an elaborate set of 15 markdown files. And then for the feedback, they have the agent generate tests. And when the test suite is green, that's enough. And then you do some manual testing and that's it. But I think that's very unsatisfying to me because the agent also generated the tests, right? So maybe then I have to think about feedback for the tests. So that's maybe test coverage. There's a resurgence of mutation testing as well, which is kind of like a test quality feedback thing. But you maybe only want to run that in the pipeline and not early on because it takes quite a lot of time. I think there's still like a lot of questions about behavior in particular. Also because as a human, I often, when I write the spec, I sometimes don't even know yet what I need. I might think that I know what I want, but then only when I see it, historically, we know we haven't been good at writing specs. So how are we going to do this validation thing? And all of these things, of course, for a lot of people, the ultimate goal is to have an agent go off by itself and you don't even look at it anymore and you hardly need any humans anymore to build anything. They all write the specs. I think even if you find that extreme or if you think that's maybe a far way out, all of these techniques are also super useful for like a supervised session, right? So for example, I've been experimenting with just having a little companion running next to my coding agent that constantly shows me the result of static code analysis, test suite, test coverage, and so on. And the agent can also access it and gets like an agent optimized summary of that state. And this gives me like an extra level of trust into what's going on. Like I don't have to look at every single thing or wait for the pipeline to run, but I can always see like my definition of good quality as far as a computer can evaluate it. I can always see like at which state that is and has it gotten better or has it gotten worse? And the agent can also see that.
Okay, so that's some kind of a gauge on your car screen, whatever, to just see how it feels.
Yeah, like a heads-up display almost, right? So, for example, when I have an agent running, doing something for a while, maybe in the meantime I've done something else, I can go back and at least I get like a first glance of, is it even worth it yet for me to look at this? Or are 50% of the tests failing? Or has the test coverage dropped 10%, even though the agent wrote a lot more code? Or, all of these like kind of almost like a triage thing. Like the low-level things that a computational, like CPU-based tool can also check for me, are those all green? And we had all of those tools in the past, but we often underuse them, or maybe it was sometimes also just not worth it always to use them because we were the harness and we were going in small steps. But I think we can revisit a lot of them to see where it's worth investing in them because it's worth replacing some of our supervision with them.
I strongly agree with that. And that's what I'm pushing for like almost 3 years since more coding with agent started. Well, in the initial phases, just using ChatGPT or simple things like that. Now it has a word and that's harness. You have a safety net that assures you that all the things are going there. Where it's a bit divergent to the ideas and the thought process I had at that point is that currently you're using only one model, because at that point I was doing something like, okay, I'm writing the tests as a human or I'm writing the code. And then you had 2 different points. But now it feels that the agent is doing everything. Obviously, it has multiple hats and you're just saying, do now adversarial code review or stuff like that. But it's still, for me, it's a bit, I'm not that confident, not that comfortable into going all in on only one tool. But it's just a matter of idea.
Yeah, and it depends on the situation, right? Like I also was talking about at QCon, like my mental model about how I decide what workflow do I use, like a simple one or an elaborate one, or how long do I let the agent go without supervision, or how much code review do I do? So my mental model for it is always that of a risk assessment, and risk is always probability plus impact plus detectability. So I think about what's the probability that AI will get it right or wrong. So for that, I have to know about the level of my context engineering, how confident am I in my specification, right, and stuff like that. What is my experience with the coding agent I'm using? And then for impact, I think about the criticality of the use case. Is it a proof of concept or a spike that's at the one end of the extreme, or is it at the other end of the extreme, a critical business workflow that I'm on call for at the weekend, so I might get called at 2 a.m. in the morning. So that's a very different impact case. And then third is detectability. So how easy is it for me to detect when or if AI has done something wrong? So those are always the 3 components I think about when I decide how much review I put into something. But I have noticed that the more I use coding agents, the better I get at this quick assessment. Like so many things that we more intuitively do after learning about other things in coding after a while. And especially the probability part, like the probability that AI gets it right or wrong, is the one where we have to build up this experience about what AI is good at and what it's not good at. And we have to understand, at least to a certain level, how a coding agent works under the hood and what tools we have at our disposal and so on. So that's the part that we have to build up with using coding agents over a period of time. And then it becomes like an experience that we have. So it's not something we can learn from a book, unfortunately, because of the weird nature of this technology.
Well, actually, it's quite interesting. And looking also at the other presentations and content that we had at QCon in London this year, is I see a lot of things coming from academia. I was surprised to see things like formal validation methods and have a resurgence. Then there was the DST, deterministic simulation testing, that is also coming to force. Because until now, it felt that the testing, the validation always is falling behind. But now things are moving a lot faster and you need more tools that are providing this kind of ability to understand where it actually comes. And I'm happy to see that other people from academia are trying to bridge the gap. I'm still curious whether it will come to any kind of mechanism that are actually pragmatic, because as you said, there is not a simple book to follow, and it feels that it's more empiric. It's trial and error. But I think there are things that currently become a reality because of this speed. But there is one other concern that I have, right? We are moving quite fast. And until not long ago, you had a debate from buy versus sell. But now you have also the part where it's vibe coded. And there are a lot of people, rather than doing the research on internet and finding the best tool for that, well, actually, I'm going to build it. And that's quite interesting, also scary from my point of view. But the biggest question that I have is, now we are using SaaSs, right? We are moving software as a service. We are using mostly models that are in the cloud. We all know that they are expensive and getting more expensive. There are all the issues on the security side. But what happens with the code that we built and we want the model to know? How are we feeding that back in?
You mean the code base as our context?
Yes, we are just changing it. But in the end, we have a model that has clean data that is from the other day.
It's kind of like part of the built-in harness is the code search tool that is available like in every coding agent, right? So every coding agent provides the LLM with different tools so that it can search the code base and analyze the code base and so on. And it seems like the default has become what seems relatively crude at first sight, providing the model with like grep and glob and find bash-based search tools like that. So text-based search tools. You might remember that in the beginning, when coding assistants were just starting out, there were a lot of them that by default were also indexing the code base. Also, Cursor still offers that as well, for example, and was there from almost the beginning. So where you turn the code base into embeddings and have like a local search over the code base as well, right? Then I also mentioned giving coding agents access to language servers, which might help them navigate like a call stack much easier if you just want to look through the call stack than if you just do a text search or something like that. And then products like AMP by SourceGraph or GitHub Copilot has an integration like that as well. They integrate the agent with code search across multiple code bases. So they actually have like sophisticated code search built up that's like a previous product or something that we previously had. Like GitHub's code search is quite powerful, for example. And then you give an agent that, right? So there's like a bunch of these different ways to do this. There's also what we see and what we also do in the legacy modernization space a lot is like taking a whole code base and actually loading it into a big graph so that you can start doing analysis. And that loading it into a graph also includes tools that take the abstract syntax tree of the code base and then enrich it with all kinds of things. Or tools like Unblocked, for example, they load the code base into a graph, but they also load your tickets, your Slack history, your wiki, and so on, right? And so they're trying to create connections between these things so that the agent has access to more nuance and semantic information about, we'll have to work on this piece of the code. That means there's all of this other context that belongs to it, and that can potentially help it make a better plan. So I think even though the default has turned into like, let's do bash tool-based, text-based search, because it's like actually quite powerful, apparently, there's still, I think, a lot of situations, especially when you have a large code base, where you might want some of these other approaches to have more powerful search that actually is aware of how the code is structured and how to navigate it, and not just based on text.
And not to flip it, the other day, GitHub Copilot sent an email where they just explained that your code base will be used for the training purposes of the model. And everybody was like just publishing on social media. How can you protect your privacy in this world where we are using coding agents?
I was a bit confused by that. I don't know yet exactly if I understand what's going on, to be honest, because that setting that everybody freaked out about is in the Copilot settings. And I thought that the setting relates to like when you're using a coding agent or like Copilot, you're sending it parts of your code because it gets that context. So I didn't understand it as like by default, they're just training models on all of the code that is on GitHub. But as the backlash was so big, that setting was there before, right? So I'm not quite sure yet. I haven't looked at it in detail what's actually going on, but I was a bit confused.
Yeah, it's odd because this thing happened last year as well, and Copilot was more in focus, but it seems that it's a recurring topic. And
Yeah. And in the Copilot for Business license, usually that setting is even switched off by default, or at least used to be. And like on an organization level, people can control that, right? So usually all of these big coding assistants, they give you options to switch this on or off. But of course, sometimes when it's defaulting to on, that's always quite annoying if it's an opt-out and not an opt-in. So maybe that's what the backlash was about, that it was the other way around before. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it was always like that and it changed. But yeah, let's see what happens. Any predictions for the upcoming 365 days? I know,
God.
it's hard.
No predictions. I mean, I'm more like, I see my role in this whole ecosystem more as the person who looks back a bit and looks at the current patterns. And then I'm often like stuck in what's happening right now. So I see a lot of this stuff happening with the harnesses, which is like more a very generic term, but I expect that we'll fill out a lot more of those pockets going forward. Something that is very hard for me to predict because there are so many confusing, contradicting signals is costs, like what's actually going to happen to costs, because it's pretty obvious that at the moment it's still very subsidized, right? Even when you have like a quote unquote flat rate that has rate limiting and stuff like that, I think it's pretty clear that people often use a lot more than would actually be part of the flat rate. But even when you use their APIs directly and you pay for tokens, like as many tokens as you use, it seems like that might also still be subsidized. And there's like all of this like bubble stuff going on with like all these companies giving each other money and, you know, building data centers that might only be done in a few years. And, you know, so it's all like, on the other hand, it also with like technical optimizations, right? It would also make sense that this gets technically more efficient. And then, you know, it might also get cheaper or it might not have to be subsidized anymore. But there's like so many signals in all directions that I find that very hard to predict.
Yeah, it's hard, but I said I'll just shoot in the dark and see what comes from your side. But I think your point is currently both OpenAI and Anthropic are private companies. And the only way how you understand what actually happens under the hood is when they do have some financing round and people are just all the rage. But if you look at the way how the stock exchange markets are going, it's not exactly like that. And also the geopolitical space, it's odd these days. The latest thing that I saw in the market is the fact that Anthropic is pushing for having an IPO this year. At that point, probably we'll understand better actually how much do they subsidize the cost and what's the real cost of everything and all these points.
Something I hope to see more, which, you know, when I use the word hope, it might seem like a positive, but I hope to see more public stories about fails of AI coding, right? In terms of like maintainability. And I mean, we're seeing like there's a regular stream of incidents and also security incidents dripping in. And the reason why I want to see more of those stories is not because I'm like, haha, you use AI and now this is happening, but because it will help us learn overall, right? Like how far we can push this. And I'm always happy to see when there are companies who are in domains where they can take more risk, trying to push this more so we can learn from it, because there are a lot of domains where you cannot take as much risk, just so that we keep the period of time in which we step into it kind of right and like create a lot of cost and pain and worse products maybe, so that we keep that period of time as short as possible and kind of like find out what is our right amount of speed and what is our right amount of harnessing and human supervision, so that we can keep quality up and build good products for users.
And to add on to the points that you had, what I think it will happen, we'll have more of these points becoming more elaborate. As you mentioned, we start having names now and contexts and concepts for that. The other thing that I expect to happen is having more ability of calling tools, like API designed specifically for agents to be able to call, and more empowered documentation that allows agents to call stuff, so to create a more ecosystem. So these are the things that I would expect to happen. You already start seeing those. Other than that, I don't know, it's game on. Things will happen, but my expectation will be that things will decrease in speed, because currently things will changing very fast, but now they kind of...
I don't know. I think it will still be fast. It's been fast for a while, but it seems like there's still so much to do and to do wrong and right, and yeah.
Excellent. We have a date for next spring to see
Yes.
to see where we are. Okay. Thank you a lot, Birgitta, for your time and for all the insights.
Thanks for having me, Olympio.